Sometimes the cruelest jokes become the greatest blessings. When grief has hollowed out your heart, even the smallest act of human kindness can feel like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Jonas Miller knew this truth better than most. The widowed Amish man had been living alone for 3 years, quietly tending his small farm in Cedar Valley, Pennsylvania. Then, one autumn morning, a group of younger men from town showed up at his gate with what they called a gift. It was a massive draft horse, wild and unmanageable, that had thrown every rider who tried to mount it. They handed Jonas the rope with barely contained smirks, expecting to watch him fail. What they didn't know was that Jonas had once been known throughout the county for his way with difficult horses. But could a broken man truly tame a broken beast? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Cedar Valley like a gentle shroud, rolling across the Pennsylvania farmland in waves that seemed to whisper secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. Jonas Miller had always been such a listener. Standing at his kitchen window, a cup of black coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, he'd watched the sun pierce through the gray veil that covered his modest 40-acre farm. The sight should have brought him peace. It once had, back when Martha would stand beside him, a small hand resting on his arm as they planned their day together. Now the window felt more like a barrier between him and the world beyond. 3 years had passed since Martha's funeral. 3 years since the pneumonia took her during what should have been a mild winter cold. The doctors at Lancaster General had done everything they could, but sometimes God's plans remain mysteries even to those who accept them with faithful hearts. Jonas had buried her in the small cemetery behind the white clapboard church where they'd been married 28 years earlier, where they'd prayed every Sunday for children who never came, where they'd found contentment in each other's company. When the world seemed too large and complicated, the farm reflected his solitude now. Where once Martha's vegetable garden had burst with tomatoes, beans, and her prized roses, now only the hardiest weeds survived Jonas's half-hearted attempts at maintenance. The chicken coop stood empty. He'd sold the birds 2 years ago when their cheerful cackling began to sound too much like the laughter that once filled his home. Even the fields lay mostly fallow, save for the small plot of corn he managed each season. More from habit than need. His daily routine had become a careful choreography of survival. Rise at 5, as he always had. Coffee and a simple breakfast of eggs and bread. Check the handful of livestock he still maintained: 2 milk cows, an aging sow, and the draft horse team of Buck and Bell that had served him faithfully for over a decade. The morning chores took him until 9, at which point the day stretched before him like an endless field. He had no desire to cross. It was during these quiet hours that Jonas felt the weight of his neighbor's pity most acutely. Cedar Valley was the kind of community where everyone knew everyone else's business, where widows received casseroles without asking, and widowers received advice whether they wanted it or not. The Amish families closest to him, the Bylers, the Yoders, the Stoltz Fuses, treated him with respectful kindness, but he could see the concern in their eyes. A man his age, 57 now, shouldn't be alone. There were widows in the district who would make fine wives, they suggested gently. Life was meant to be shared. They reminded him during community gatherings, but it was the English townspeople, the non-Amish residents who lived in the valley alongside the plain folk, who posed the greater challenge to Jonas's peace. Not all of them, certainly many, had been friends to him and Martha for years, but a small group of younger men, led by Tom Brennan, seemed to view Jonas's grief as a source of entertainment rather than respect. Tom owned a feed store in town and considered himself something of a local character. At 42, he possessed the kind of crude humor that played well with his friends, but wore thin quickly with anyone possessing genuine maturity. His companions, Carl Hodges and Mike Sullivan, worked construction, and spent their evenings at Murphy's Tavern, where they'd grown fond of speculating about the crazy Amish hermit who lived out on Mill Creek Road. Jonas had overheard their comments during his infrequent trips to town for supplies. They weren't malicious exactly, but they carried the thoughtless cruelty of men who had never experienced true loss. They wondered aloud why he didn't just sell the farm and move to one of those retirement communities. They joked about his old-fashioned clothing and his horse-drawn buggy. Mostly, they seemed fascinated by his solitude, as if they couldn't comprehend how a man could choose silence over their brand of boisterous companionship. What they didn't know, what nobody in Cedar Valley remembered anymore, was that Jonas Miller hadn't always been the quiet, broken widower who kept to himself. There had been a time when his name carried weight in the county's horse circles, when farmers from 3 states would seek his advice about a difficult animal. His father, Samuel Miller, had possessed an almost mystical understanding of horses, and he'd passed that gift to his son, along with the worn leather tools that still hung in Jonas's barn. The old halter, crafted by Samuel's own hands from leather he'd tanned himself, served as a daily reminder of abilities Jonas had allowed to rust like unused machinery. Its supple brown surface had darkened with age and wear, shaped by countless interactions with the powerful animals it had guided. Jonas could still remember the feel of it in his young hands, the way his father had shown him to read a horse's temperament through the tension in the leather, the shift of weight, the angle of ears, and the set of eyes. "A horse will tell you everything you need to know," Samuel had said, "if you're willing to listen with more than your ears." Those lessons had served Jonas well through his 20s and 30s, when he'd built a reputation that extended far beyond Cedar Valley. He'd worked with horses that others had declared hopeless stallions that had turned vicious, mares that wouldn't take a bridle, draft teams that balked at the plow. Each success had added to his quiet confidence, his sense of purpose in the world. But that was before Martha became ill, before the long nights at the hospital and the slow realization that all the gentle strength that served him with horses couldn't save the woman he loved. After her death, he'd gradually withdrawn from that world. The phone calls from desperate horse owners went unreturned. The referrals from veterinarians were politely declined. The gift his father had given him, the ability to reach troubled animals with patience and understanding, had seemed to wither alongside his will to engage with the world. Now his barn stood as a monument to that former life. Buck and Bell, his faithful draft team, grew fat and lazy in their stalls, used only for the lightest work. The training equipment his father had crafted, the long lines, the round pen sections, the carefully balanced bits and bridles gathered dust on wooden pegs. Sometimes Jonas would find himself standing in the barn's doorway, breathing in the familiar scents of hay and leather and horse sweat, remembering the satisfaction of earning an animal's trust. Sarah Most had tried to draw him back into the community's embrace. The widow lived on the adjacent farm with her grown son David and his young family, and she possessed the kind of gentle persistence that had worn down stronger walls than Jonas's grief. She'd begun bringing him meals shortly after Martha's funeral, always with some practical excuse. She'd made too much soup, or she'd baked extra bread, or she had vegetables from her garden that would spoil if not used quickly. Jonas appreciated her kindness, even as he recognized it for what it was, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man who wasn't sure he wanted to be saved. Sarah had lost her own husband 8 years earlier, and she'd navigated the treacherous waters of Amish widowhood with grace and determination. She understood the peculiar loneliness that came with sleeping in a bed grown too large, of making coffee for one when your hands remembered the motions of making it for two. Healing isn't about forgetting, she'd told him one afternoon as they sat on his front porch, watching her grandson chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. It's about learning to carry the love differently. The wisdom in her words hadn't been lost on Jonas, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your heart were different things entirely. He could acknowledge that Martha wouldn't want him to spend his remaining years in solitude, that she'd want him to find purpose and perhaps even companionship again. But knowing it didn't make the prospect any less daunting, any less like a betrayal of the promise he'd made to love her until death parted them. As autumn deepened into October, Jonas had settled into a routine that felt sustainable, if not particularly fulfilling. The harvest was mostly complete, the hay safely stored in his barn, the last of the garden-produced canned or root salad for winter. He'd begun the annual ritual of preparing for the harsh Pennsylvania winters, checking the barn roof for loose shingles, splitting firewood for the kitchen stove, ensuring his livestock had adequate shelter. It was during this season of preparation, this time of drawing inward before winter's bite, that the morning came when Tom Brennan's pickup truck turned into Jonas's driveway, followed by Carl Hodges's newer Ford and Mike Sullivan's battered Chevy. Jonas watched from his kitchen window as the three men climbed out of their vehicles, their breath visible in the crisp morning air, their voices carrying the kind of forced joviality that preceded either very good news or very bad jokes. He didn't need to wonder which category this visit would fall into. The way they kept glancing toward his barn, the way Tom carried himself with the swagger of a man about to pull off what he considered a masterstroke of humor, told Jonas everything he needed to know. They'd come to provide entertainment for themselves at his expense, and his options were limited to playing their game or enduring their disappointment. Either choice would serve their purposes equally well. Jonas set down his coffee cup and reached for his hat, checking his reflection briefly in the small mirror Martha had hung beside the kitchen door. His beard had grown grayer in the past 3 years, his shoulders perhaps a bit more stooped, but his eyes still held the quiet strength that had seen him through 5 decades of life's challenges. Whatever these men had planned, he would meet it with the same dignity that had sustained him through darker days than this. As he stepped onto his front porch, Jonas's hand unconsciously moved to touch the chain around his neck, where Martha's simple gold wedding band rested against his heart. The metal had grown warm from his body heat, a small comfort that reminded him he was still capable of carrying love, even in its transformed state. Whatever was about to unfold in his driveway, he would face it as the man she had believed him to be: patient, strong, and unwilling to be diminished by those who mistook gentleness for weakness. The sound that greeted Jonas as he approached the 3 men was unlike anything he'd heard on his peaceful farm in years, a deep rumbling whinny that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath his feet, followed by the sharp crack of wood under tremendous pressure. Behind Tom Brennan's pickup truck sat a livestock trailer that rocked back and forth with each impact from whatever was trapped inside, the metal sides reverberating like thunder with every kick. "Morning, Jonas," Tom called out, his grin wide enough to show the gap between his front teeth. "Hope we didn't wake you up. We brought you a little present." Carl and Mike flanked him on either side, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and barely suppressed laughter. They reminded Jonas of schoolboys who'd planted a frog in the teacher's desk drawer, their excitement palpable as they waited for the payoff of their elaborate joke. Another tremendous crash came from the trailer, this time accompanied by the screech of metal against metal. Whatever animal was inside possessed enough strength to test the structural integrity of the heavy-duty livestock hauler, and Jonas found himself genuinely concerned about the safety of everyone present. "Sounds like you've got quite a problem in there," Jonas observed mildly, his tone betraying none of the wariness he felt. "Not our problem anymore," Mike chimed in, his voice pitched higher than usual with nervous energy. "See, we heard you might be in the market for a new horse. Old Buck and Bell are getting pretty long in the tooth, aren't they?" Jonas glanced toward his barn, where his faithful draft team was undoubtedly listening to the commotion with the philosophical calm that came from years of steady work and regular meals. They were indeed aging. Buck was pushing 20, Mel a year younger, but they still had several good seasons left in them. More importantly, they were predictable, gentle creatures who understood their role in the quiet rhythm of his daily life. "Don't really need another horse right now," Jonas replied. But Tom was already moving toward the back of the trailer, producing a set of keys from his jacket pocket. "Wow, that's the beauty of it," Tom said, fitting a key into the trailer's lock. "This one's free. Consider it a gift from the community." The word gift carried enough emphasis to make its true meaning clear. This wasn't generosity. This was theater. The three men had gone to considerable trouble to set up this morning's entertainment, and Jonas was expected to provide the climactic performance of their little drama. "Might be better to leave him in there until we can set up some proper containment," Jonas suggested, noting the way the trailer continued to shake with the animal's movements. "Sounds like he's pretty worked up." "Nah, he'll be fine once he gets some room to move around," Carl said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Besides, we can't stay here all day. Got work to do." Tom released the latch and immediately stepped well back from the trailer's rear gate, a precaution that spoke volumes about the animal inside. The other two men followed suit, creating a semicircle at what they clearly hoped was a safe distance. Jonas found himself holding the lead rope that Tom had thrust into his hands, a thick, frayed piece of manila hemp that showed the wear patterns of an animal that pulled hard and pulled often. The trailer's gate swung open with a metallic groan, and for a moment nothing happened. The silence stretched long enough for Jonas to wonder if the animal had somehow injured itself during its violent protests. Then a massive head appeared in the opening, followed by shoulders that seemed too broad for the trailer's width, and finally the full, magnificent, and terrifying presence of the largest draft horse Jonas had ever seen. The animal was a Percheron, easily 18 hands high and probably weighing close to 2,000 pounds. His coat was a deep bay that gleamed even in the autumn morning light, his mane and tail black as midnight. But it was his eyes that captured Jonas's attention. Dark, intelligent, and filled with a wildness that spoke of fear rather than malice. This wasn't a vicious horse. This was a desperate one. The moment the horse's hooves touched solid ground, he exploded into motion. His head shot up, his ears flattened against his skull, and he let out a sound that was part whinny, part roar of frustration. The lead rope in Jonas's hands went taut as a bowstring as nearly a ton of panicked horseflesh hit the end of it. Jonas's first instinct was to fight the pull, to use his own strength to control the animal's movement. But some deeper knowledge, buried beneath 3 years of grief and inaction, made him step forward instead of bracing back. The horse's momentum carried them both across the gravel driveway, but Jonas moved with the animal rather than against him, allowing the initial explosion of energy to dissipate naturally. "Holy hell," Mike breathed, taking several more steps backward. "Look at the size of that thing." The horse Jonas had already begun thinking of him as Gideon, though he couldn't say why the biblical name had come to mind, stood trembling in the center of the driveway, his massive frame taut with the potential for further flight. Sweat darkened his neck and flanks despite the cool morning air, and his breathing came in short, sharp bursts that spoke of genuine terror. "Where did you get him?" Jonas asked, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Fellow over in Berks County was practically paying us to take him," Tom replied, his own voice less steady than it had been earlier. The reality of the animal's size and unpredictable nature was clearly beginning to penetrate his earlier confidence. Said he'd been through 3 different owners in the past year. Nobody can do anything with him. What happened to set him off? Like this? Who knows? Some horses are just born crazy. The important thing is he's young, only 5 years old, and he's got good bloodlines. Could be worth a lot of money to someone who can handle him. Jonas studied the horse's conformation with an eye trained by decades of experience. Gideon was indeed a magnificent animal, with the powerful hindquarters and sloped shoulders that marked superior breeding. His legs were clean and straight, his head well-shaped and intelligent. Under different circumstances, he would have been the pride of any draft horse operation. "You really want to just leave him here?" Jonas asked. "That's the idea," Carl said, though he was still keeping his distance. "You've got the facilities, and we heard you used to be pretty good with difficult horses back in the day." The phrase, "back in the day," stung more than Jonas cared to admit. It reduced decades of skill and experience to a quaint memory, something nostalgic rather than current. But he pushed the hurt aside and focused on the immediate problem. Gideon had calmed slightly, though his head remained high and his muscles stayed coiled for flight. "I'll need some help getting him to the barn," Jonas said. "Actually, we need to get going," Tom replied quickly. "Early day at the shop, you know how it is." The three men were already moving toward their trucks, their eagerness to leave now that their joke had been delivered obvious to everyone present. They'd expected Jonas to fail spectacularly, to be dragged around his own driveway by an animal he couldn't control. The fact that he was still on his feet and holding the lead rope seemed to disappoint them slightly, though they clearly viewed this as merely delaying the inevitable entertainment. "You sure about this?" Mike called from beside his truck. "He's a big one." "I'll manage," Jonas replied, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had once driven him to accept challenges others wouldn't dare attempt. The trucks pulled away in a chorus of diesel engines and gravel under tires, leaving Jonas alone with 2,000 pounds of unpredictable horse in his driveway. Gideon watched the vehicles disappear, then turned his attention back to the man holding his lead rope. His ears pricked forward slightly, a sign of curiosity rather than aggression, and Jonas felt a spark of hope. "Well, boy," he said quietly, "looks like it's just you and me now." The horse's response was to test the lead rope again, though with less violence than before. Jonas let him move, maintaining just enough pressure to stay connected while allowing Gideon to explore the boundaries of his new situation. It was a delicate dance, one that required reading the animal's intentions through the subtle language of muscle tension and weight distribution. As they stood there in the morning light, horse and man taking each other's measure, Jonas became aware of faces appearing at windows throughout the valley. News traveled fast in a community this size, and the spectacle of 3 trucks and a livestock trailer arriving at the Miller farm would have attracted attention. He could see Mrs. Byler peering from behind her kitchen curtains, and the odor. Children had gathered at their yard fence to watch the proceedings. The weight of their attention pressed against Jonas's shoulders like a physical thing. Some would be genuinely concerned for his safety, knowing that a horse of Gideon's size could kill a man without meaning to. Others would be waiting for the entertainment Tom and his friends had promised, expecting to witness the humbling of a man who'd grown too isolated for his own good. But as Jonas stood there, feeling the familiar weight of the lead rope in his hands and reading the complex messages in Gideon's body language, he realized something important. He didn't care what they expected to see. For the first time in 3 years, he was faced with a problem that required all of his attention, all of his skill, and all of the patience his father had taught him to cultivate. The frayed lead rope in his hands told its own story of previous failures, of owners who tried to dominate this magnificent animal through force and frustration. But Jonas could see what they'd missed, the intelligence in those dark eyes, the way Gideon's ears moved constantly as he processed every sound and movement, the careful precision with which he placed his massive hooves even in his agitation. This wasn't a crazy horse. This was a horse that had learned not to trust the humans who held his lead rope. And if there was one thing Jonas Miller understood, it was the careful navigation of a world that felt too dangerous to trust. The first 3 days with Gideon tested every ounce of patience Jonas had accumulated in 57 years of living. The massive Percheron seemed to view his new surroundings as an elaborate trap, responding to even the gentlest approach with explosive reactions that sent him careening around the paddock like a pinball made of muscle and bone. Jonas had managed to lead into the barn that first morning. Though lead was perhaps too generous a term for what had actually been a controlled chaos of stops, starts, and sudden sideways leaps that would have been comical if they hadn't been so dangerous. Gideon had spooked at the barn cats, the hanging water buckets, the shadows cast by the hay mow, and the perfectly ordinary sight of Buck and Belle watching curiously from their stalls. "Easy, boy," Jonas murmured for what felt like the 1,000th time, standing at the paddock fence and watching Gideon pace the perimeter of his temporary home. The horse had worn a path in the grass along the fence line, his massive hooves carving deeper grooves with each circuit. His head remained high, his ears constantly swiveling as he catalogued every sound from the surrounding farm. The paddock itself was secure enough to hold even an animal of Gideon's size, built from oak posts and reinforced with steel mesh that Jonas's father had installed decades earlier when the farm had housed a larger herd. But watching the horse's restless energy, Jonas wondered if any enclosure would feel safe to an animal that had clearly been failed by every human who tried to work with him. It was during his afternoon observation session on the third day that Jonas remembered the old trunk in the barn's tack room. He'd avoided that corner of the barn since Martha's death, partly because it housed too many memories and partly because he'd had no use for the training equipment stored there. But something about Gideon's intelligent desperation reminded him of lessons his father had shared about horses that had lost their way. The trunk sat beneath a dusty tarp, its leather straps cracked with age but still functional. Jonas lifted the heavy lid and breathed in the scent of old leather and cedar. Shavings, a combination that transported him instantly to childhood afternoons spent at his father's side. The contents lay exactly as he'd left them 3 years earlier. Coils of long lines, a collection of bits and hackamores, leather pouches filled with tools whose purposes were as familiar as his own hands. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his father's training journal. Samuel Miller had kept meticulous notes about every horse that had passed through their farm, documenting not just the techniques that had worked, but the reasoning behind each approach. Jonas opened the weathered notebook and found himself reading his father's careful script, advice that had guided him through his own early successes with difficult horses. "A horse in fear," one entry read, "must first learn that stillness brings safety. Movement without purpose only confirms his worst expectations about the world." Jonas closed the journal and looked out through the tack room window toward the paddock, where Gideon continued his restless pacing. The horse had barely touched his feed, though he'd drunk water steadily. His coat was dull with dried sweat despite the cool weather, and his eyes held the hollow look of an animal operating on nervous energy rather than genuine strength. That evening, Jonas made a decision that would have seemed foolish to anyone watching. Instead of heading to the house for supper, he pulled up a battered wooden chair to the paddock fence and simply sat. He didn't try to call to the horse or extend his hand through the rails. He simply positioned himself where Gideon could see him clearly and waited. The horse's initial response was predictable snorting, head tossing, and an increase in the speed of his pacing. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, something began to shift. Gideon's circuits became slightly less frantic, his head dropping a fraction of an inch as he grew accustomed to the motionless figure by the fence. Jonas had brought his father's journal with him, and he read by the fading light, occasionally speaking aloud when a passage seemed particularly relevant to his current situation. His voice was low and steady, offering no demands or expectations, just the rhythm of words in the gathering darkness. "The first goal," he read, "is never compliance but curiosity. A curious horse is a horse that might someday choose to trust." As if summoned by the words, Gideon slowed his pacing and turned to regard the man sitting by the fence. It was the first time the horse had looked directly at Jonas without the wild edge of panic in his expression. They studied each other in the dying light, predator and prey, engaging in the ancient negotiation that had brought their species together thousands of years earlier. "You've had a hard time of it, haven't you?" Jonas said quietly. "People trying to make you into something you're not, probably, or trying to break what they couldn't understand." Gideon's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, and he took a single step toward the fence before stopping, his internal alarm still too sensitive for closer approach. But it was progress. The first genuine progress since his arrival 3 days earlier. Jonas remained in his chair until full darkness made reading impossible, then rose slowly and gathered his things. As he turned to go, he was surprised to see Gideon standing motionless near the center of the paddock, his head turned to follow Jonas's movement toward the house. "Good night, boy," Jonas called softly. "I'll see you in the morning." The fourth day brought the first real breakthrough. Jonas arrived at the paddock at dawn to find Gideon standing quietly near the water trough, his head lowered in what looked almost like relaxation. The frantic pacing had stopped, though the horse remained alert to every movement around the farm. Following his father's advice about the importance of routine, Jonas established a schedule that revolved entirely around Gideon's needs and comfort. Morning feed at 6, fresh water at 10. An afternoon session of simply sitting nearby and reading aloud, evening feed at 5. He made no attempt to enter the paddock or handle the horse directly, focusing instead on becoming a predictable, non-threatening presence in Gideon's daily experience. The breakthrough came during the afternoon session on day 6. Jonas was reading from a section of the journal that dealt with gentling wild-caught horses when he became aware that the usual sounds from the paddock had stopped. He looked up to find Gideon standing less than 10 feet from the fence, his magnificent head extended toward Jonas in an unmistakable gesture of curiosity. "Well, hello there," Jonas murmured, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Decided I might be worth investigating after all?" The horse's response was to take another careful step forward, then another, until his massive head hung over the top rail of the fence. Jonas could see the individual whiskers on his muzzle, could count the different shades of brown in his intelligent eyes. More importantly, he could see that the wildness had been replaced by something approaching calm. "You're a handsome fellow, aren't you?" Jonas said, still not moving from his chair. "Someone put a lot of care into breeding you. Shame they didn't put the same care into understanding you." Gideon lowered his head slightly, and for a moment Jonas thought the horse might actually allow himself to be touched. But some invisible boundary held him back, and after a long moment, he stepped away from the fence and resumed his position near the water trough. Still, the interaction had lasted nearly 5 minutes, 5 minutes of voluntary proximity from an animal that had been a whirlwind of panic just days earlier. Jonas felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the satisfaction that came from earning an animal's tentative trust through patience rather than dominance. That evening, as Jonas sat on his front porch reviewing the day's progress, he saw Sarah Mast walking across the field that separated their properties. She carried a covered basket and wore the expression of someone who'd been watching developments with interest. "Heard you got yourself a new project," she said, settling into the chair beside his without invitation. "Mighty big project from what folks are saying." "He's settling in," Jonas replied, accepting the basket she handed him. The warm scent of fresh bread and apple butter drifted up when he lifted the cloth cover. "Starting to think there might be a good horse under all that fear." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Fear can make any creature do things they wouldn't normally consider, makes them forget who they really are." Jonas glanced at her, recognizing the wisdom that came from her own experience with loss and healing. "You think I'm taking on more than I can handle?" "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that sometimes the Lord puts exactly what we need right in our path, even when it doesn't look like a gift at first glance." As if summoned by their conversation, a low whinny drifted across the evening air from the direction of the paddock. It was the first sound Gideon had made that wasn't driven by panic or frustration, a simple acknowledgement of the voices he could hear, perhaps even a tentative attempt at communication. Jonas smiled, feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 3 years. It wasn't happiness, exactly, but it was the absence of the gray emptiness that had filled his days since Martha's death. For the first time since the funeral, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow's sunrise and the work it would bring. 2 weeks into October, Jonas experienced his first real conversation with Gideon. It wasn't the sort of exchange that would make sense to anyone watching from a distance. No words were spoken. No physical contact was made, but it represented a profound shift in their relationship that Jonas felt in his bones. The morning had started badly. A sudden thunderstorm had rolled through the valley just before dawn, bringing with it the kind of crashing thunder and lightning that set every animal on the farm into a state of high alert. Jonas found Gideon pacing frantically in the paddock, his eyes rolling white with terror as he searched for escape from the celestial assault. "Easy, boy," Jonas called from the fence, but his voice was lost in the sound of rain hammering against the barn roof. Another flash of lightning illuminated the paddock in stark relief, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the ground. Gideon reared, his front hooves pawing at the air, a magnificent and terrifying display of raw power. Jonas made a decision that went against every safety protocol he'd ever learned about handling panicked horses. He opened the paddock gate and stepped inside. Gideon's reaction was immediate and predictable. He bolted toward the far corner of the enclosure, putting as much distance as possible between himself and this new threat. But the paddock wasn't large enough to contain his fear, and he began the frantic pacing that Jonas recognized as a prelude to genuine panic. "It's all right," Jonas said, his voice pitched low and steady despite the storm raging around them. "I know it's frightening. Used to scare me too when I was young." He positioned himself in the center of the paddock and simply stood there, letting the rain soak through his jacket while Gideon circled him at a distance of about 20 feet. Each circuit brought the horse slightly closer, as if Jonas's stillness was a kind of gravity that gradually overcame the centrifugal force of fear. "Martha hated thunderstorms," Jonas continued, speaking more to himself than to the horse. "First one we experienced after we were married. She crawled right into bed with me and stayed there until it passed. 26 years old and scared as a child." Another flash of lightning briefly turned the world white, but this time Gideon didn't rear. His ears flicked toward Jonas, and his pacing slowed to a trot, then to a walk. The horse was listening, not just to the words but to the tone, the lack of demand or expectation in Jonas's voice. "She got over it eventually," Jonas said, wiping rain from his face. "Started staying up during storms, making hot cocoa and watching the lightning from the kitchen window. Said it was beautiful once you stopped being afraid of it." The storm began to move on, the intervals between lightning and thunder growing longer as the worst of it passed to the east. Gideon had stopped, pacing entirely now, standing about 10 feet from Jonas with his head lowered, breathing hard but no longer panicked. Water dripped from his mane and streamed down his powerful neck, but his eyes had lost their wild edge. Jonas reached slowly into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small apple, one of several he'd taken to carrying since establishing his evening routine with the horse. He held it out on his palm, not extending his arm toward Gideon, but simply making it visible. "Peace offering," he said quietly. "Though I suppose I should be the one making apologies. You didn't ask for any of this, the storm. Being moved to a strange place, having to deal with another human who thinks he knows what's best for you." Gideon's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the apple, and Jonas could see the internal struggle playing out in the horse's expression. Want warred with wariness, hunger with the hard-learned lesson that accepting anything from humans usually came with strings attached. "No strings this time," Jonas said, as if reading the horse's thoughts. "Just an apple from someone who understands what it's like to be alone in the storm." The approach took nearly 10 minutes. Gideon moved like a wild animal approaching a trap, each step tentative and carefully considered. He would advance 2 steps, then stop and evaluate, his ears constantly moving as he monitored every sound around the farm. But gradually, inexorably, he closed the distance between them. When Gideon's massive head finally lowered to Jonas's outstretched palm, the moment felt more significant than any ribbon or trophy Jonas had ever earned with horses. The gentle touch of whiskers against his skin, the careful way the horse lifted the apple without any threat of teeth against flesh, the brief moment when their eyes met over the span of Jonas's extended arm. It was a conversation more meaningful than most he'd had with humans in recent years. "There's a good boy," Jonas murmured, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "I knew you had it in you." Gideon crunched the apple thoughtfully, and for the first time since his arrival, his posture suggested something approaching contentment. The storm had passed, leaving behind the fresh scent of rain-washed earth and the promise of cleared skies. Around them, the farm was coming back to life, birds resuming their morning songs, buck and bell nickering from the barn, the normal rhythms of the day reasserting themselves. That afternoon, Jonas made another discovery that helped explain Gideon's difficult history. While mucking out the temporary stall he'd prepared for the horse, he found a small spade that had belonged to Martha, its handle worn smooth by her hands during countless hours in her beloved garden. The sight of it stopped him cold, bringing back a flood of memories he'd been carefully avoiding. Martha had possessed what Jonas could only describe as a gift for growing things. Under her care, even the most stubborn plants seemed to flourish, as if her mere presence convinced them that life was worth the effort. She'd spend hours in her garden, talking to her tomatoes and roses with the same gentle attention that Jonas had once given to troubled horses. "Plants are like people," she told him once. Dirt smudged on her cheek as she transplanted seedlings. "They'll grow toward whatever gives them the most light and love." Jonas stood in the barn holding her spade, and for the first time since her death, the memory brought warmth instead of pain. Perhaps it was Gideon's presence, the reminder that healing was possible even after profound damage. But Jonas found himself able to think about Martha's wisdom without the crushing weight of loss that usually accompanied such recollections. That evening, Sarah arrived with another basket of food and news from the community that Jonas received with mixed feelings. "Word's getting around about your horse," she said, settling into her usual chair on the front porch. "Folks are starting to pay attention." "What kind of attention?" "The curious kind, mostly. Some are saying you've lost your mind, taking on an animal like that at your age. Others remember what you used to be able to do with difficult horses, wondering if you've still got the touch." Jonas considered this information while watching Gideon graze peacefully in the paddock. The horse had begun eating regularly, his coat was regaining its shine, and he no longer paced the fence line with desperate energy. To Jonas, the progress was obvious and encouraging, but he understood that others might see only a dangerous animal that could turn violent without warning. "Tom Brennan was in Miller's store yesterday," Sarah continued carefully, "asking questions about how you were getting along with your gift. Seemed disappointed to hear that you hadn't been killed yet." The casual cruelty of the comment stung, but Jonas found himself less affected by it than he might have been weeks earlier. Tom's opinion had always mattered less than Tom himself believed, and now it seemed almost irrelevant. Jonas had more important things to focus on than the entertainment value of his potential failure. "Let them talk," Jonas said. "Gideon and I understand each other well enough." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Gideon lifted his head from the grass and looked toward the porch. He nickered softly, the first sound he'd made that could be interpreted as a greeting, and Jonas felt his heart lift in response. "He's calling to you," Sarah observed with a smile. "That's new." Jonas rose from his chair and walked to the paddock fence, where Gideon approached without hesitation. The transformation was remarkable, from the terrified, explosive animal that had emerged from the trailer 3 weeks earlier to this calm, curious creature who seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "Evening, boy," Jonas said, producing another apple from his pocket. "How was your day?" Gideon accepted the treat with the careful politeness of a well-mannered guest, then allowed Jonas to stroke his neck, the first time he'd permitted such contact. His skin was warm and solid under Jonas's palm, and his breathing remained steady and relaxed despite the intimate nature of the interaction. "You've got magic in those hands," Sarah called from the porch. "Always did." But Jonas knew it wasn't magic. It was patience, consistency, and the willingness to meet another creature where they were instead of demanding they become something else. These were lessons his father had taught him about horses, lessons Martha had embodied in her relationships with everyone she met, and lessons Jonas was relearning through his work with Gideon. That night, as Jonas prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. Not the distant future. He wasn't ready for plans that ambitious. But tomorrow, next week, the changing seasons ahead, Gideon would need proper training if he was going to become a useful member of the farm. And Jonas felt the familiar stirring of professional interest as he considered the best approach. It had been 3 years since he'd worked seriously with a horse. 3 years since he'd felt the satisfaction that came from helping an animal discover its own potential. The skills were still there, rust-covered but intact, waiting for the right moment to emerge from their long hibernation. As he lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the farm settling into night, Jonas realized that something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with the world. The gray emptiness that had defined his days since Martha's death hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer felt permanent. Gideon had given him something to care about beyond his own grief, a puzzle that required all of his attention and skill to solve. For the first time in 3 years, Jonas Miller fell asleep thinking about tomorrow. November arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made Pennsylvania autumns legendary, and with it came the first real test of the partnership Jonas and Gideon had been building. The old plow harness that Jonas had discovered in the back of his tack room required considerable modification to fit Gideon's massive frame. But the work gave him something to focus on during the long evenings when the farm fell quiet. The harness itself was a testament to his father's craftsmanship, hand-stitched leather that had aged to the color of dark honey, with brass fittings that still gleamed despite decades of use. Jonas had worn the leather supple with neat's foot oil and adjusted every strap and buckle to accommodate Gideon's broader chest and longer back. More than the physical modifications, the harness represented hope, the possibility that the magnificent horse might become a working partner rather than simply an expensive yard ornament. "You ready for this, boy?" Jonas asked, holding up the collar that would rest across Gideon's shoulders. They stood in the barn's center aisle, where the familiar sense of hay and leather seemed to calm the horse's natural wariness about new equipment. Gideon's response was to lower his head and investigate the harness with the careful attention he brought to everything in his environment. His nostrils flared as he processed the smells of leather oil, the lingering scent of the horses who had worn it before him. After a moment, he lifted his head and looked at Jonas with what could only be described as curiosity. The harnessing process took nearly an hour. Not because Gideon was difficult, but because Jonas refused to rush any part of it. Each strap was introduced slowly, each buckle fastened with deliberate care, while Jonas maintained a running commentary about what he was doing and why. The horse stood with the patience of an animal that had learned to trust the human working around him, occasionally turning his head to watch Jonas's movements, but showing none of the explosive reactions that had characterized his early days on the farm. "Your first job's going to be easy," Jonas explained as he made final adjustments to the traces. "Just pulling some logs out of the back 40. Nothing fancy, just honest work." The logs in question were the result of a summer storm that had brought down several large oaks in the woodlot behind the barn. Jonas had been meaning to clear them since August, but the work had seemed too daunting for Buck and Belle, who were showing their age more with each passing season. Gideon's size and strength made the job not just possible, but almost effortless. The first time the traces went tight and Gideon felt the weight of the log behind him, Jonas held his breath. This was the moment when many horses would panic, when the unfamiliar sensation of pulling a load would trigger every instinct that said flee first and think later. But Gideon simply lowered his head, found his footing, and leaned into the work with the steady determination of an animal bred for exactly this purpose. "That's it," Jonas encouraged, walking alongside the horse as they made their way toward the woodpile. Steady and smooth. No hurry. The partnership that emerged over the following days was everything Jonas had hoped for and more. Gideon possessed not just the physical strength to handle heavy work, but the intelligence to understand what was being asked of him and the willingness to give his best effort. More importantly, he seemed to enjoy the work. His ears pricked forward with interest as they tackled each new task. Word of their success traveled quickly through the valley's informal communication network. Jonas would look up from his work to find neighbors lingering by his fence, ostensibly checking their own livestock, but clearly interested in watching the enormous draft horse that had supposedly been impossible to handle. Their attention made him slightly uncomfortable, but he took satisfaction in the obvious admiration that Gideon's performance drew from knowledgeable horsemen. It was during one of these impromptu viewing sessions that Paul Yoder approached the fence with a request. That surprised Jonas. "Got a 3-year-old filly that's giving me trouble," Paul said without preamble. He was a man of few words who ran one of the most successful dairy operations in the valley. "Heard you might be willing to take a look at her." Jonas felt a familiar flutter of interest mixed with apprehension. It had been years since anyone had sought his advice about a difficult horse. Years since he'd felt confident enough in his abilities to offer help. But watching Gideon work, seeing the obvious bond they'd developed, had reminded him of skills he'd thought lost forever. "What kind of trouble?" Jonas asked. "Won't take a harness. Acts like the leather's going to kill her. Previous owner must have done something to spook her, but I can't figure out what." The description brought back memories of similar cases from Jonas's earlier career. Horses whose bad experiences had taught them to fear specific aspects of human interaction. Each case had been unique, requiring patience and insight to unravel the specific trauma that was driving the unwanted behavior. "I could take a look," Jonas heard himself saying. "Can't promise anything, but I could see what she needs." Paul's relief was obvious. "I'll bring her over tomorrow morning, if that works for you. Been thinking I might have to sell her for dog food if something doesn't change soon." That evening, as Jonas groomed Gideon in preparation for the night, he found himself talking through his thoughts about the upcoming challenge. "Might have a visitor tomorrow," he told the horse, running a brush over the glossy bay coat that had regained its healthy shine. "Young filly with some problems. Think you could help me show her that humans aren't all bad." Gideon's response was to turn his head and nick her softly, a sound that had become his standard greeting for Jonas. The simple gesture of acknowledgement warmed Jonas in ways he was still learning to understand. After 3 years of isolation, of conversations conducted primarily with his own memories, having another living creature genuinely pleased to see him felt like a minor miracle. Sarah's arrival interrupted his grooming session, as it did most evenings now. She'd taken to timing her visits to coincide with his work in the barn. claiming that the walk was good for her health, but clearly enjoying the opportunity to observe the progress he and Gideon were making. "Heard Paul Yoder was by today," she said, settling onto a hay bale where she could watch Jonas work. "Word is you might be taking on another project." "Just going to take a look," Jonas replied, but he could hear the anticipation in his own voice. "Been a long time since I worked with a problem horse. Not sure I remember everything I used to know." "Some things you don't forget," Sarah said gently. "Like riding a bicycle, my grandmother used to say. The knowledge is still there, just waiting for the right moment to come back." Jonas considered this as he worked. Certainly his success with Gideon suggested that his fundamental understanding of horse psychology remained intact. But each animal was different. Each case presented its own unique challenges, and the consequences of failure could be serious for both horse and handler. "Besides," Sarah continued, "you've got help now." She nodded toward Gideon, who was standing relaxed and content under Jonas's ministrations. The horse had indeed become more than just a personal project. He was a living testament to the possibility of healing, a demonstration that even the most damaged creatures could learn to trust again, given enough patience and understanding. "You think he understands what we're talking about?" Jonas asked, noting the way Gideon's ears tracked their conversation. "I think he understands more than most people give him credit for," Sarah replied. "Horses have a way of reading situations that goes beyond just listening to words. He knows you're different than you were when he first arrived. Calmer, more sure of yourself." Jonas reflected on this observation as he finished his grooming routine. It was true that he felt different, though the change had been so gradual that he hadn't fully recognized it until Sarah pointed it out. The gray heaviness that had characterized his days since Martha's death hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer felt overwhelming. He had work to do, problems to solve, a magnificent animal that depended on him for care and guidance stod as he led Gideon to his stall for the night. Jonas found himself looking forward to tomorrow's challenge with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Paul Yoder's troubled filly represented more than just another training problem. She was an opportunity to test whether the confidence he'd rebuilt with Gideon could extend to other horses, other situations. "What do you think, boy?" he asked as he latched the stall door. "Ready to help an old horseman remember what he used to do for a living?" Gideon's answer was a gentle nicker and a final request for scratches behind his ears, a ritual that had become as important to Jonas as it apparently was to the horse. As he stood there in the warm barn, listening to the comfortable sounds of animals settling in for the night, Jonas felt something he hadn't experienced since before Martha's illness. Genuine excitement about what tomorrow might bring. Paul Yoder's filly arrived just after dawn on a trailer that spoke of careful maintenance and practical use rather than show. The 3-year-old standardbred was everything Paul had described: well-built, intelligent-looking, and absolutely terrified of the harness hanging in the trailer's tack compartment. Her reaction to the sight of the leather straps was immediate and violent. Ears pinned flat, eyes rolling white, and a series of sharp kicks that left dents in the trailer's metal sides. "Started about 6 months ago," Paul explained as they watched the filly's agitated movements from a safe distance. Previous owner swore she was broke to drive, but something's got her convinced that harness leather is going to kill her. Jonas studied the horse's body language with the eye of someone who'd spent decades reading the subtle communications that horses offered to those willing to pay attention. This wasn't simple high spirits or lack of training. This was genuine terror, the kind that came from a specific traumatic experience that had taught the filly to associate harness work with pain or fear. "Let's get her settled first," Jonas suggested. "No point trying to work with her while she's this wound up." The process of unloading took nearly an hour. Every time Paul approached with a lead rope, the filly would retreat to the far corner of the trailer, trembling with an intensity that spoke of memories too powerful to ignore. Jonas finally suggested a different approach, leaving the trailer. Doors open and simply waiting for curiosity to overcome fear. Sometimes the best way to catch a scared horse is to let them catch you, he explained, settling into the same patient stance that had served him so well with Gideon. The strategy worked. Within 30 minutes, the filly had crept to the trailer's edge, drawn by the sounds and scents of the farm around her. Gideon's presence in the nearby paddock seemed particularly intriguing, his calm confidence apparently reassuring to an animal whose world had been shaped by anxiety and mistrust. Once the filly was safely installed in the small paddock adjacent to Gideon's, Jonas began the careful process of evaluation that would determine his approach to her rehabilitation. He started with simple observation, noting how she moved, how she responded to various stimuli, how she interacted with Gideon through the fence that separated them. The breakthrough came when Jonas brought out Martha's small wooden cross, a simple piece of carved oak that he'd discovered among her belongings while searching for something entirely different. He hadn't intended to carry it with him to the barn, but something about the filly's obvious distress had reminded him of his wife's gentle approach to frightened creatures. Martha had possessed an almost supernatural ability to calm upset animals, whether they were barn cats with infected wounds or calves separated too early from their mothers. She'd never forced her attention on them, never demanded that they accept her help, but somehow they always seemed to understand that she meant no harm. She'd know exactly what to do with you, Jonas murmured to the filly who had approached. The fence where he stood had a way of making every creature feel safe, even when they had good reason not to trust humans. The filly's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, and for the first time since her arrival, she seemed genuinely curious rather than simply fearful. Jonas began talking to her about Martha, about the garden she'd tended with such care, about her belief that every living thing deserved patience and understanding. "He used to tell me that fear was just love wearing a disguise," he said, watching the filly's gradual relaxation as his voice washed over her. Said that once you figured out what something was afraid of losing, you could usually help them find the courage to try again. The insight hit Jonas with the force of revelation. The filly wasn't afraid of harnesses in general. She was afraid of losing control, of being trapped in a situation where her ability to flee was compromised. Someone had taught her that submission meant helplessness, and helplessness meant pain. Over the following weeks, Jonas developed a training program that focused entirely on giving the filly choices. Instead of forcing her to accept the harness, he made it available and waited for her to investigate it voluntarily. Instead of insisting that she stand still for grooming, he allowed her to move away whenever she felt uncomfortable, gradually building her confidence that cooperation was optional rather than mandatory. The work was slow and sometimes frustrating, but Jonas found himself energized by the challenge in ways he hadn't expected. Each small breakthrough, the first time the filly allowed him to drape a lead rope over her neck, the morning she stood calmly while he brushed her shoulder, the afternoon she actually nuzzled the harness leather instead of fleeing from it, felt like a personal victory. Word of his success spread through the valley's farming community with the speed that news always traveled in rural areas where entertainment was scarce and everyone's business was considered fair game for discussion. Jonas would look up from his work to find small groups of neighbors gathered at his fence, ostensibly discussing weather or crop prices, but clearly more interested in watching the horse whisperer, who had supposedly lost his touch but was apparently getting it back. The attention made him uncomfortable, but it also brought unexpected benefits. Farmers who had struggled with difficult animals for months began seeking his advice, sometimes offering payment that Jonas felt awkward accepting, but that his practical nature couldn't afford to refuse. His reputation, dormant for 3 years, began to reassert itself throughout the county. More importantly, the work gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing since Martha's death. Each morning, brought new challenges, new problems to solve, new opportunities to help animals that others had given up on. He found himself thinking like a horseman again, analyzing behavioral problems with the systematic approach that had once made him sought after from 3 states away. Sarah noticed the change during one of her evening visits, commenting on the energy that seemed to radiate from him as he discussed his latest cases. "You're coming back to yourself," she observed, watching him demonstrate a training technique with Gideon that he'd developed for the filly. "Martha would be proud to see you like this." The comment should have brought the familiar stab of loss that any mention of his wife usually triggered, but instead, Jonas felt only warmth. For the first time since her death, thinking about Martha didn't feel like reopening a wound. It felt like honoring her memory by living the life she would have wanted him to live. "She always said I was at my best when I was helping something. That couldn't help itself," Jonas replied, scratching behind Gideon's ears. "Guess she knew me better than I knew myself." As November deepened into December, Jonas began to feel something he hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not happiness. Exactly. That seemed too ambitious a goal for someone still carrying the weight of profound loss. But contentment was achievable, a state of being that acknowledged pain without being consumed by it. The farm had come alive again under his renewed attention. Fences that had sagged for years were repaired and strengthened. Paddocks that had stood empty were cleaned and prepared for the steady stream of problem horses that owners brought for evaluation and training. The barn, once a monument to abandoned dreams, hummed with activity and purpose. Most importantly, Jonas had rediscovered the satisfaction that came from work that mattered, from solving problems that required all of his skill and experience. Each successful training case reminded him that he possessed abilities that were valuable to others, that his knowledge and patience could make a real difference in the lives of both animals and the people who cared for them. As he stood in his barn one evening, watching Gideon and the filly share hay across their fence line, Jonas realized that the hollow feeling that had defined his existence since Martha's death had been filled with something new: hope. Not hope for a return to the way things were, that was impossible and perhaps not even desirable, but hope for a future that honored the past, while embracing new possibilities. The carved wooden cross in his pocket seemed to warm against his fingers as he made his evening rounds, checking water buckets and securing latches against the winter wind. Martha's influence lived on in the gentle approach he brought to frightened animals, in the patience he'd learned from watching her tend her garden, in the understanding that healing took time and couldn't be rushed. For the first time in 3 years, Jonas Miller fell asleep thinking not about what he'd lost, but about what he was finding. The emergency radio that Jonas kept in his kitchen for weather warnings had been silent for weeks, its digital display showing nothing more threatening than the usual December cold front predictions for southeastern Pennsylvania. So when it crackled to life at 3:17 on a Tuesday morning, the urgent tone of the automated voice cut through his sleep like a blade. The National Weather Service has issued a flash flood warning for Chester County, Lancaster County, and portions of Berks County. Heavy rainfall combined with rapid snowmelt has caused water levels to rise dramatically in Mill Creek, Pequea Creek, and tributaries. Residents in low-lying areas should seek higher ground immediately. This is not a test. Jonas sat up in bed, trying to make sense of the warning. December floods were rare in their region. Winter storms typically brought snow rather than the heavy rain that could cause serious flooding. But as he listened to the rain hammering against his bedroom windows with an intensity that suggested tropical storm conditions rather than a typical winter weather system, he began to understand the scope of what was happening. The phone started ringing before he could fully process the radio warning. First, Paul Yoder, calling to report that Mill Creek had already overflowed its banks and was threatening his dairy barn. Then David Mast, Sarah's son, with word that the back roads were already impassable and that several families in the valley's lower elevations were effectively trapped. "Water's rising faster than anyone expected," David said, his voice tight with concern. "Emergency services are overwhelmed. They've got calls from 3 counties and not nearly enough resources to handle them all." Jonas pulled on his clothes and stepped onto his front porch, where the scope of the disaster became immediately apparent. Mill Creek, normally a modest stream that meandered peacefully through the valley, had transformed into a raging torrent that had claimed the lower pastures and was advancing steadily toward the farmhouses scattered throughout the area. The Byler family, whose farm sat in a natural depression that provided excellent drainage during normal conditions, were in particular danger. Jonas could see lights burning in their windows, could imagine them moving their livestock to higher ground and praying that the old farmhouse would withstand whatever the creek threw at it. But it was the sight of the Stoltzfus place that truly drove home the severity of the situation. The white-clapboard house where elderly Bishop Stoltzfus lived with his daughter and their 3 young children sat directly in the path of the advancing water. Even from his elevated position, Jonas could see that the normal access roads were already underwater, cutting off any possibility of evacuation by conventional means. The radio crackled again, with updates that grew progressively more alarming. Emergency responders were reporting multiple water rescues in progress, but their boats and high-water vehicles were stretched beyond capacity. Several families remained trapped in areas that conventional rescue equipment couldn't reach, and the Weather Service was predicting that water levels would continue rising for several more hours. It was Sarah who articulated the thought that had been forming in Jonas's mind since the first emergency call. "That big horse of yours," she said, appearing at his kitchen door with her coat soaked and her usually neat hair plastered against her head. "How is he with water?" Jonas had been wondering the same thing. Gideon's size and sure-footedness had made him invaluable for heavy work around the farm, but wading through floodwaters would test abilities that Jonas had never had occasion to evaluate. More importantly, it would require a level of trust between horse and rider that they built over months of careful work but had never tested under genuine life-or-death conditions. "Only one way to find out," Jonas replied, reaching for his coat. The trip to the barn felt like a journey through an alien landscape. Water that had never existed before lapped at the edges of the gravel driveway, and the familiar sounds of the farm had been replaced by the rush of moving water and the distant sounds of emergency sirens. Gideon stood in his stall with his ears pricked toward the unusual commotion, alert but not panicked. "Going to ask something of you that's not in any training manual," Jonas said as he began the process of saddling the massive horse. "Some folks are in trouble, and we might be the only ones who can reach them." Gideon's response was to lower his head for the bridle with the calm acceptance that had become his standard reaction to Jonas's requests. But as they stepped out of the barn into the storm, Jonas felt the horse's muscles tense, with awareness of just how different this morning was from their usual routine. The first test came at the edge of what had once been Mill Creek but was now a brown torrent carrying everything from fence posts to overturned outbuildings. Gideon approached the water with the caution of an animal whose survival instincts were finely tuned. But when Jonas asked him to step into the current, he responded without hesitation. The sensation of wading through moving water on an animal of Gideon's size was unlike anything Jonas had experienced. The horse's massive hooves found purchase on the creek bottom even as the current tugged at his legs, and his powerful muscles adjusted automatically to maintain balance and forward progress. More importantly, his calm confidence seemed to communicate itself to Jonas, who found his own nervousness giving way to focused determination. Their destination was the Stoltzfus farm, where the advancing water had already reached the front porch of the main house. Jonas could see movement in the upstairs windows. The family had retreated to the second floor as the ground level became uninhabitable. But even the second story wouldn't be safe if the water continued rising at its current rate. The approach to the house required crossing what had become a temporary lake, with Gideon swimming for stretches where the water was too deep for even his long legs to reach bottom. Jonas had never asked a draft horse to swim while carrying a rider, but Gideon's response was to simply adapt his gait to the requirements of the situation, his powerful stroke carrying them steadily toward their destination. Bishop Stoltzfus appeared in the upstairs window as they approached, his weathered face showing relief and amazement in equal measure. The sight of Jonas Miller, the quiet widower who'd become something of a hermit, arriving like a maritime cavalry on the back of the enormous horse that everyone had assumed was impossible to handle, would have been remarkable under any circumstances. "Can you get to the window?" Jonas called over the sound of rushing water. The rescue that followed tested every aspect of the partnership Jonas and Gideon had built. The horse stood rock steady in chest-deep water while 3 children and their mother were helped from the second-story window onto his broad back. Bishop Stoltzfus, despite his 78 years, proved surprisingly agile as he made the transition from window to horseback, though Jonas could see the toll the stress was taking on the elderly man's strength. The return journey to higher ground felt eternal, with Gideon carrying a load that would have challenged him under ideal conditions, while navigating currents that seemed determined to sweep them all downstream. But the big horse had found his purpose in the crisis, and his steady progress through the dangerous water spoke to reserves of strength and determination that even Jonas hadn't fully appreciated. It was only as they reached safety that Jonas realized the true scope of what they'd accomplished and what was still required of them. Other families remained trapped throughout the valley, and emergency services were still hours away from being able to mount effective rescue operations in the hardest-hit areas. Tom Brennan was waiting for them at the evacuation center that had been hastily established at the community school on higher ground. The same man who had delivered Gideon as a joke 6 months earlier now stood in the rain with his hat in his hands, his usual swagger replaced by desperate humility. "Jonas," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "My sister's family, they're trapped at the old Morrison place down by the creek. Emergency folks say it'll be hours before they can get equipment in there." The irony wasn't lost on Jonas. The men who had expected to be entertained by his failure with an unmanageable horse were now asking him to risk his life and Gideon's to save their families. But as he looked at Tom's anguished expression, Jonas felt no satisfaction in the reversal of fortunes, only the weight of responsibility that came with being the right person in the right place at the right time. "How many people?" Jonas asked, already knowing he would make the attempt regardless of the answer. "5, Tom replied. "My sister, her husband, and 3 kids. Water's already to the 2nd floor." Jonas looked at Gideon, who stood calmly despite the chaos around them, his breathing steady and his attention focused on whatever Jonas might ask of him next. The horse had already proven himself capable of heroic effort, but each rescue would push them both closer to the limits of what was physically possible. "We'll get them," Jonas said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The brass compass that had belonged to Jonas's father felt like a lifeline as he checked their heading for the 3rd rescue mission of the morning. Samuel Miller had carried the instrument through 40 years of Pennsylvania winters, using it to navigate home through blizzards that could turn familiar countryside into an alien landscape. Now his son relied on the same weathered brass face to guide him and Gideon through floodwaters that had transformed Cedar Valley into something unrecognizable. "Southeast by south," Jonas murmured, reading the compass bearing toward the Morrison place where Tom Brennan's sister and her family waited for rescue. The old farmhouse sat in what had once been a gentle depression beside Mill Creek, a location that provided natural irrigation during dry seasons, but had become a death trap as the creek transformed into a raging river. Gideon stood beside him, In the community school parking lot, steam rising from his massive body despite the cold rain that continued to fall. They'd already completed 2 rescues since dawn. First the Stoltfus family, then the elderly Weaver couple, whose arthritis had prevented them from reaching higher ground on their own. Each mission had pushed both horse and rider closer to exhaustion. But Gideon's willingness to enter the dangerous water remained unshaken. Jonas ran his hands over the horse's legs, checking for cuts or swelling that might indicate injury from the debris-filled floodwaters. Finding nothing alarming, he moved to examine the improvised rescue gear that Sarah and several other community members had assembled. Additional lead ropes for securing multiple passengers, a waterproof bag containing emergency supplies, and strips of bright fabric that could serve as signals if they encountered trouble. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said quietly, appearing at his elbow with a thermos of hot coffee that Jonas accepted gratefully. "Emergency services will be here eventually. The National Guard is mobilizing. Eventually might be too late." Jonas replied, studying the water level markers that volunteers had been placing throughout the morning. The creek was still rising, though more slowly than during the initial surge. "Every hour we wait is an hour those children spend in a house that might not stand up to the current." The truth was more complex than Jonas cared to articulate even to himself. Somewhere during the morning's rescues, he discovered that the combination of Gideon's strength and his own knowledge of the valley's geography made them uniquely suited for this work. More importantly, he'd found a sense of purpose that went beyond mere obligation. This was what he was supposed to be doing, what all his years of training difficult horses had been preparing him for. "Your father would be proud," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the sound of rain on the school's metal roof. "He always said you had a gift for reading water as well as horses." Jonas smiled at the memory. Samuel Miller had indeed possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict how water would behave during spring freshets and autumn storms. Knowledge born from decades of farming in a valley where creeks could rise 10 feet in as many minutes. He taught Jonas to read the subtle signs, the color of the water, the debris it carried, the sound it made as it flowed over different types of terrain. Fast water over rocks sounds different than fast water over mud, his father had explained. During one of their countless walks along Mill Creek's banks, and moving water will always find the path of least resistance, even if that path changes from year to year. That knowledge was serving Jonas well now as he planned their approach to the Morrison farm. The direct route would take them through the deepest water, where Gideon would be forced to swim for nearly a quarter mile. But Jonas remembered a slight rise in the terrain that might still be shallow enough for the horse to maintain his footing. A longer route, but potentially safer for both rescuer and rescued. Tom Brennan approached as Jonas prepared to mount Gideon for the 3rd time that day. The man's usual cocky demeanor had been completely replaced by raw anxiety, and his hands shook as he offered Jonas a handheld radio. "Channel 7, Tom said. "My brother-in-law Jim has one too. He'll be watching for you from the upstairs window." Jonas clipped the radio to his coat and swung into the saddle, feeling Gideon's immediate response to his weight and the subtle cues that indicated they were about to undertake serious work. The horse had learned to read Jonas's intentions with remarkable accuracy, and his posture shifted to the alert readiness that had characterized their previous rescue missions. "Be careful out there," Carl Hodges called from the small crowd that had gathered to watch their departure. The man who had once participated in delivering Gideon as a cruel joke now stood with genuine respect and concern written across his face. "That water's moving faster than it looks." The transformation in how the community viewed both Jonas and Gideon was remarkable, though Jonas was too focused on the task ahead to fully appreciate the irony. Men who had questioned his judgment in accepting such a difficult horse now watched in awe as the partnership he'd built through months of patient work proved capable of heroic achievement. the journey toward the Morrison place began on relatively solid ground, with Gideon picking his way carefully through puddles and temporary streams that marked the flood's outer edges. But as they descended toward what had once been Mill Creek's floodplain, the water grew deeper and the current stronger, until Jonas found himself riding a swimming horse through a landscape that bore no resemblance to the peaceful valley he'd called home for most of his life. The debris in the water told the story of the flood's destructive power fence posts torn from the ground, hay bales floating like enormous corks, pieces of buildings that had been too close to the creek's normal path. Gideon navigated through the obstacles with the careful attention of an animal whose survival depended on making no mistakes, his powerful strokes carrying them steadily toward their destination. Halfway to the Morrison farm, Jonas began to understand the true scope of what they were attempting. The house, visible now as a small island surrounded by brown water, sat lower than he'd remembered. The current around it was strong enough to carry away anything that wasn't firmly anchored, and he could see debris piled against the structure's upstream side like a dam that threatened to divert even more water toward the building. The radio crackled with Jim Morrison's voice, tight with controlled panic. "Jonas, can you see us? We're in the upstairs bedroom facing the road. Water's been coming up steady, probably 6 inches since you started toward us." "I see you," Jonas replied, studying the approach to the house. "Going to circle around and come at you from the downstream side. Current's too strong to fight head-on." The maneuver required all of Gideon's strength and agility. Swimming against even the edge of the main current, the horse had to work harder than Jonas had ever asked of him, his breathing growing labored as he fought to maintain their chosen course. But gradually, stroke by powerful stroke, they made their way to the relative calm behind the house. "Rope coming down," Jim called from the window, and Jonas caught the line on the second attempt. Securing it to his saddle horn, he positioned Gideon as close to the building as the horse's swimming ability would allow. The evacuation process took nearly 20 minutes that felt like hours. Each family member had to be helped from the window onto Gideon's back, a terrifying transition that required perfect timing and absolute trust in the horse's stability. Tom's sister, carrying her youngest child, went first, her face white with fear, but her movements steady and deliberate. The older children followed, then Jim, whose weight brought their total load to what Jonas estimated was near Gideon's maximum carrying capacity. "Hold tight," Jonas called over the sound of rushing water. "It's going to be a long ride to dry ground." The return journey tested every aspect of their partnership. Gideon, carrying 5 passengers in addition to Jonas, could no longer swim with his usual power and grace. Instead, he had to rely on careful navigation and steady determination, choosing his route with the wisdom of an animal that understood the consequences of making a wrong turn. Jonas found himself thinking about the lessons his father had taught him about reading water and weather, about the patience required to work with animals that could kill you if they panicked, about the responsibility that came with possessing skills that others needed. All of those lessons seemed to converge in this moment as he guided Gideon through the most dangerous water they'd yet encountered. "Almost there," he called to his passengers as the community school's parking lot came into view. "Gideon's got you. He won't let you down." And the magnificent horse didn't. Step by careful step, stroke by powerful stroke, he carried them all to safety, arriving at the evacuation center with his passengers shaken but unharmed and his own strength nearly spent. As willing hands helped the Morrison family down from Gideon's back, Jonas felt the horse's legs tremble with exhaustion beneath him. They'd pushed the limits of what was physically possible, and both of them would need time to recover before attempting another rescue. But even as he dismounted and began the process of cooling down his heroic partner, Jonas could see that their work wasn't finished. Other families remained trapped throughout the valley, and the emergency services that everyone had been counting on were still hours away from being able to mount effective rescue operations. The question was whether Gideon had enough left in him for one more mission, and whether Jonas had the right to ask it of him. The water-damaged family photograph that Jonas pulled from his coat pocket as they prepared for what might be their final rescue mission showed 5 faces smiling at the camera during happier times. The Brennan family, Tom's sister Carol, her husband Jim, and their 3 children stood in front of the Morrison farmhouse during what looked like a summer barbecue, their casual poses and genuine smiles capturing a moment of simple contentment. That the morning's flood had shattered. Jonas had retrieved the photograph from the Morrison house's kitchen table as they'd evacuated the family, an impulse that he couldn't fully explain even to himself. Perhaps it was the need to preserve something from a home that might not survive the flood. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that these were the faces he'd risked everything to save. Now, as he studied Gideon's condition in the community school parking lot, Jonas wondered if they had the strength for one more mission. The massive Percheron stood with his head lowered, his breathing still elevated from their latest rescue, sweat steaming from his coat despite the cold rain that continued to fall. They'd already saved 8 people in 3 separate trips through water that would have challenged even the most experienced emergency responders. "There's one more," David Mass said quietly, approaching Jonas with the kind of hesitant respect that had replaced the earlier skepticism about his abilities. "Sarah's trapped at her house." Water came up faster than anyone expected. The words hit Jonas like a physical blow. Sarah, who had been his connection to the community during his darkest years, who had brought him meals and conversation and gentle encouragement when he'd been ready to give up on the world entirely, was now in danger that only he and Gideon might be able to address. "How bad?" Jonas asked, his voice steady despite the fear that was building in his chest. "Bad," David replied. She was helping move livestock to higher ground when the creek jumped its banks. Got cut off from the main road. Emergency folks say the water around her place is too deep and moving too fast for their equipment. Jonas looked at Gideon, trying to assess honestly whether the horse had enough strength left for another swimming rescue through treacherous water. The Percheron's legs were solid beneath him. His breathing was returning to normal, and his attention remained focused on Jonas in the way that indicated readiness for whatever might be asked of him. But Jonas could see the toll that the morning's work had taken, the slight tremor in the powerful muscles, the way Gideon favored his right foreleg just slightly when he shifted his weight. "She's been good to us," Jonas said to the horse, running, his hand along the strong neck that had carried so many people to safety. "What do you think, boy? Got one more in you?" Gideon's response was to lift his head and nicker softly, the same sound he'd made on countless mornings when Jonas approached, with halter and lead rope. It was a sound that spoke of partnership and trust, of an animal that understood the importance of the work they were doing and was willing to give everything he had to see it through. The journey to Sarah's farm required navigating the most dangerous water they'd yet encountered. Mill Creek had continued rising throughout the morning, and what had been challenging but manageable currents during their earlier rescues had become a raging torrent that carried everything from uprooted trees to sections of buildings downstream toward the Susquehanna River. Jonas guided Gideon along the edge of the main current, using every trick his father had taught him about reading water to find the safest possible route. The horse responded to each subtle shift in Jonas's weight and leg pressure, his powerful body adjusting automatically to the demands of swimming through floodwaters, while carrying a rider who needed to remain alert and responsive to changing conditions. The sight that greeted them as Sarah's farm came into view was both encouraging and terrifying. The house itself sat on ground high enough to keep it above the flood waters, but the barn and outbuildings were partially submerged, and the normal access routes were completely underwater. More concerning was the debris field that had collected. Around the property, a tangle of fence posts, hay bales, and unidentifiable wreckage that created a maze of obstacles between Jonas and his destination. Sarah. Jonas called as they approached the house, and he felt relief flood through him as her voice answered from an upstairs window. "Jonas Miller, what in the world are you doing out there?" She shouted back, though he could hear the emotion in her voice, even over the sound of rushing water. "Thought you might need a ride to higher ground," Jonas replied, maneuvering Gideon through the debris field with careful precision. "Hope you're not afraid of swimming horses." The rescue itself was the most technically challenging they'd attempted. Sarah's house sat at an angle to the current that made a direct approach impossible, forcing Jonas to navigate a complex route that took them around submerged outbuildings and through openings in the debris field that were barely wide enough for Gideon's massive frame. When they finally reached the house, Sarah appeared at the second-story window with a rope that she'd fashioned from bedsheets, a practical solution that spoke to the kind of problem-solving ability that had helped her manage a farm on her own for 8 years. But the transition from window to horseback, always the most dangerous part of any water rescue, was complicated by Gideon's exhaustion and the strong current that threatened to push them away from the building. "Easy, boy," Jonas murmured as he felt the horse struggle to maintain position against the rushing water. "Just a little longer. Just hold steady for a little longer." Gideon's response was to plant his hooves more firmly and lean into the current, with the kind of determination that spoke to reserves of strength that went beyond the physical. This was a horse that understood the importance of what they were doing, that was willing to give everything he had to ensure that no one was left behind. Sarah's descent from the window required perfect timing and absolute trust in both horse and rider. At 62, she possessed neither the agility of the younger people they'd rescued, nor the desperation that might have overcome natural caution. Instead, she moved with the measured precision of someone who understood that mistakes in this situation could be fatal. The moment when she settled behind Jonas in the saddle, her arms wrapping around his waist for security, felt like the completion of something important. This was the woman who had refused to let him disappear into grief after Martha's death, who had brought him meals and conversation and gentle insistence that life was still worth living. Now he was returning that gift, carrying her to safety, on the back of the horse that had taught him to hope again. The return journey tested every ounce of Gideon's remaining strength. The horse's stroke was no longer the powerful, rhythmic motion that had characterized their earlier rescues. Now it was the determined effort of an animal operating on willpower alone. Jonas could feel the tremor in the massive muscles beneath him, could sense the way Gideon's breathing grew more labored with each passing minute. "Come on, boy," Jonas whispered, his voice carrying all the encouragement and gratitude he felt for this magnificent animal that had given so much. "Just a little farther. We're almost home." And somehow, stroke by determined stroke, Gideon carried them both to safety. When his hooves finally touched solid ground at the community school parking lot, Jonas felt the horse's legs buckle slightly with exhaustion before he caught himself and stood firm. They'd done it 4 successful rescues, 12 people brought to safety through water that had defeated conventional emergency equipment. As willing hands helped Sarah down from Gideon's back, Jonas remained in the saddle for a moment longer, running his hands along the horse's neck and feeling the powerful heartbeat that had driven their heroic efforts throughout the morning. The photograph in his pocket reminded him of the lives they'd saved, but it was the living warmth of the horse beneath him that spoke to what they'd accomplished together. "Thank you," he whispered to Gideon, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." The blue fabric ribbon from Sarah's dress that Jonas found clutched in his trembling hand as they reached the evacuation center would later serve as a tangible reminder of the moment when everything almost went wrong. Torn and muddy from their harrowing escape through the floodwaters, The simple piece of cloth represented both the fragility of human life and the strength that could emerge when ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances. The near disaster had occurred during their final approach to safety, when Gideon's exhaustion finally began to overcome his determination. Jonas had felt the horse's stride falter as they navigated the last stretch of deep water, had sensed the moment when the massive Percheron's strength reached its absolute limit. For a terrifying few seconds, it seemed as though they might all be swept downstream by a current that had grown stronger as the floodwaters continued to rise. It was Sarah who had saved them, her quick thinking and calm actions preventing what could have been a tragic end to their rescue efforts. As Gideon struggled to maintain his footing in the rushing water, she had spotted a partially submerged fence line that offered potential handholds, guiding Jonas towards solid support that allowed the exhausted horse to rest for the crucial moments. He needed to gather his remaining strength. "There," she had called over the sound of rushing water, pointing toward the fence post that emerged from the flood like a lifeline. "Get into those posts. Let him catch his breath." The strategy had worked, but just barely. Gideon had clung to the fence line with the desperation of an animal that understood how close they'd all come to disaster, his powerful chest heaving as he fought to recover enough strength for the final push to safety. Jonas had felt the horse's legs trembling beneath him, had seen the way Gideon's eyes rolled white with exhaustion and fear. "Easy, boy," Jonas had whispered, his own voice shaking with the adrenaline of their near miss. "We're going to make it. Just breathe. Just rest for a minute, and then we'll get home." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Jonas had wondered if they were true. Gideon had already given more than any horse should be asked to give, had pushed himself beyond the normal limits of endurance to save people who had once viewed him as nothing more than the subject of a cruel joke. The thought that his heroic efforts might end in tragedy was almost too painful to contemplate. It was during those tense moments at the fence line that the true measure of their partnership became clear. Instead of panicking or giving up, Gideon had seemed to draw strength from Jonas's presence, from the calm confidence in his rider's voice, even in the face of mortal danger. And Jonas, in turn, had found himself able to think clearly and act decisively because of his absolute trust in the horse's courage and determination. The final push to safety had required everything they both had left. Gideon's last swimming efforts were powered more by heart than by muscle, his stroke irregular but determined as he fought against the current that seemed intent on claiming them all. Jonas had felt the horse's strength ebbing with each passing second, had known that they had only moments before exhaustion would make further progress impossible. When Gideon's hooves finally touched the solid ground of the evacuation center parking lot, the horse's legs had buckled completely. Only Jonas's quick dismount and the immediate support of willing hands had prevented a complete collapse. But even so, the magnificent Percheron had stood trembling with exhaustion, his head hanging low and his breathing labored. "Get him some blankets," Jonas had called to the crowd that gathered around them. "And water, but not too much at once. He's pushed himself harder than any horse should have to." The community's response had been immediate and overwhelming. People who had once questioned Jonas's judgment in accepting such a difficult animal now surrounded Gideon with the kind of reverent care usually reserved for war heroes. Blankets appeared as if by magic. Warm water was brought in buckets, and gentle hands worked to cool down the horse's overheated muscles. Tom Brennan had been among the first to reach them, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine gratitude and something approaching awe. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice breaking as he looked at Jonas and then at Gideon. "My sister, her kids, you saved them all. And after what we did to you, after the way we treated you, that doesn't matter now?" Jonas replied, his attention focused entirely on Gideon's condition. The horse's breathing was beginning to slow, and the trembling in his legs was less pronounced. But Jonas could see that the morning's efforts had taken a severe toll. "All that matters is that everyone's safe." But even as he spoke the words, Jonas felt the weight of what they had accomplished settling over him like a physical presence. 4 separate rescue missions through water that had defeated conventional emergency equipment. 12 people brought to safety when no one else could reach them. A partnership between man and horse that had been forged through months of patient work and tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Sarah, still wearing her torn dress but otherwise unharmed, had approached as the crowd worked to care for Gideon. Her eyes were bright with tears as she looked at the horse that had carried her to safety and the man who had risked everything to save her. "He's magnificent," she said quietly, her hand resting gently on Gideon's neck. "They both are." The blue ribbon in Jonas's pocket, torn from Sarah's dress during their desperate escape, would serve as a permanent reminder of this day, not just of the near disaster they had narrowly avoided, but of the moment when the community's perception of both Jonas and Gideon had been permanently transformed. The cruel joke that had brought them together had become something far more significant, a demonstration of what was possible when patience, trust, and determination combined in the face of genuine need. As the emergency vehicles finally began arriving from neighboring counties, Jonas found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months earlier, Gideon had been an unmanageable problem that no one wanted. Jonas had been a broken widower who had withdrawn from the world in his grief. Now they stood together as heroes, their partnership a testament to the possibility of healing and redemption, even in the darkest circumstances. The floodwaters would eventually recede, the damage would be repaired, and life in Cedar Valley would return to something approaching normal. But the memory of this day of a magnificent horse and a grieving man who had found purpose in each other's company would endure as long as people gathered to tell stories about courage, community, and the unexpected ways that grace could enter human lives. The new leather halter that Jonas crafted for Gideon during the quiet weeks following the flood bore no resemblance to the frayed lead rope that had accompanied the horse's arrival 8 months earlier. Made from the finest leather Jonas could source, with brass fittings that gleamed like jewelry and stitching that spoke to decades of practiced skill. The halter was more than functional equipment. It was a work of art that celebrated the partnership between man and horse that had captured the imagination of everyone who had witnessed their heroic rescue efforts. Jonas worked on the halter during the long January evenings when the farm lay quiet under a blanket of snow, his hands moving with the sure precision of someone who had learned leatherwork at his father's side. Each stitch was placed with deliberate care, each adjustment made with Gideon's comfort and dignity in mind. The halter would serve as both practical equipment and permanent symbol of what they had achieved together. The flood had changed everything. In Cedar Valley, though not always in ways that were immediately obvious, the physical damage had been repaired with remarkable speed. Barns rebuilt, fences replaced, roads graded and resurfaced. But the emotional and social transformation that had accompanied the disaster proved more lasting and significant than any of the material improvements. Jonas found himself at the center of a community that no longer viewed him as the isolated widower who had withdrawn from the world in his grief. Instead, he had become something approaching a local legend, the quiet horseman whose partnership with an impossible animal had saved 12 lives when conventional rescue efforts had failed. The change in how people spoke to him, looked at him, included him in their conversations and decisions, was both gratifying and sometimes overwhelming for someone who had grown accustomed to solitude. The request for his help with problem horses had increased dramatically following the flood, with farmers from 3 counties seeking his expertise with animals that others had declared hopeless. His reputation, dormant for 3 years following Martha's death, had not only returned but had been enhanced by the dramatic demonstration of what patient, skilled horsemanship could accomplish under extreme circumstances. More significantly, the flood had forced Jonas to confront the reality that his self-imposed isolation had not honored Martha's memory as he had believed, but had instead diminished the impact of the lessons she had taught him about compassion, patience, and the importance of remaining connected to the community around him. Her influence lived on most powerfully when he used the gifts she had recognized in him to help others, whether they were frightened animals or people in desperate need. The transformation in his relationship with Sarah had been gradual but unmistakable. What had begun as neighborly kindness during his period of grief had evolved into something deeper and more complex, not a replacement for what he had shared with Martha, but a different kind of partnership that honored the past while embracing the possibility of future happiness. "You're different now," Sarah observed one evening as they sat together on Jonas's front porch, watching Gideon graze peacefully in the paddock that had become his permanent home. "More like the man Martha used to describe when she talked about your early years together." Jonas considered this assessment while listening to the comfortable sounds of the farm settling into evening. It was true that he felt more like his younger self than he had since Martha's illness, more confident in his abilities, more engaged with the world around him, more willing to take on challenges that required all of his skill and experience. "Think she would approve?" he asked, the question carrying weight that went beyond their current conversation. "I think," Sarah replied carefully, "that she would be proud to see you living fully again instead of just surviving." "I think she would. Love knowing that her garden spade helped you remember what it felt like to nurture growing things." The reference to Martha's garden tool, which had played such a crucial role in his early work with Gideon, brought a smile to Jonas's face. So many small artifacts and memories had contributed to his healing. His father's training journal, the brass compass that had guided them through the flood, the simple wooden cross that reminded him of Martha's faith in the possibility of redemption. But it was the halter he'd made for Gideon that best represented the journey they had traveled together. Like their partnership itself, it had been crafted with patience and attention to detail, designed to last for years of honest work while celebrating the beauty and dignity of the animal that wore it. The formal presentation of the halter took place on a crisp February morning when the winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered farm. Gideon approached with the calm confidence that had replaced his earlier fearfulness, allowing Jonas to slip the new leather over his massive head with the easy cooperation of an animal that trusted completely in his handler's intentions. "There," Jonas said, stepping back to admire how the rich leather complemented Gideon's bay coat and intelligent expression. "Now you look like the hero everyone knows you are." The transformation was remarkable. What had once been an unmanageable problem that no one wanted had become the most admired horse in 3 counties. An animal whose strength and courage had saved lives, and whose partnership with a grieving widower had demonstrated the healing power of patience, trust, and mutual respect. Tom Brennan, Carl Hodges, and Mike Sullivan had all visited the farm multiple times since the flood, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine respect and something approaching friendship. They no longer saw Jonas as an isolated eccentric worthy of cruel jokes, but as a man whose quiet competence had proved invaluable when their community faced genuine crisis. "Still can't believe that's the same horse we brought you last spring," Tom admitted during one of these visits, watching Gideon work calmly in harness as he helped Jonas clear fallen trees from the back pasture. "Thought for sure he'd kill you within a week." "He just needed someone to listen to what he was trying to say," Jonas replied, his tone carrying no trace of resentment for the cruel intentions that had originally brought Gideon to his farm. "Most problem horses aren't really problems. They're just animals that haven't found the right person to understand them." As spring returned to Cedar Valley, Jonas found himself looking forward to the future with an anticipation he hadn't felt since before Martha's illness. The farm was thriving under his renewed attention. His reputation as a horse trainer had brought both satisfaction and financial security, and his relationship with Sarah had deepened into something that honored the past while embracing new possibilities. Most importantly, he had learned that healing didn't require forgetting. That love could take new forms without diminishing what had come before. And that sometimes the greatest gifts arrived, disguised as problems that no one else wanted to solve. Standing in his barn, his evening approached, watching Gideon contentedly munch hay while wearing the halter that celebrated their extraordinary partnership. Jonas felt Martha's presence not as a source of pain, but as a gentle reminder that life was meant to be lived fully, with courage and compassion and openness to whatever unexpected blessings might be waiting just around the corner. The frayed lead rope that had brought Gideon to his farm hung on a peg in the tack room now, a museum piece that reminded Jonas of how far they had both traveled, from broken widower and impossible horse to community heroes whose partnership had saved lives and inspired everyone who witnessed their journey. It was a transformation that proved redemption was possible for anyone willing to approach life's challenges with patience, faith, and the understanding that sometimes the most valuable gifts come wrapped in the most unlikely packages.